Thank you very much, Tracy. Yes, hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Burns. I'm from the School of Psychology, alongside Gosili Baisu and Anita Sena as well. We are colleagues at the School of Psychology, and thanks for giving us this time today to present our research on perceptions of multicultural education in psychology higher education. So this is a quick overview of what we will present today. So firstly, I'll present the 5-dimensional understanding of multicultural education developed by James Banks that has underpinned all of this work. I'll then briefly present details of our qualitative pilot study, which explored multicultural education as it relates to psychology. I'll then outline the scale of multicultural education in psychology that was developed from this. And then my colleague and co-author Gosili will then present the findings of the exploratory factor analysis that we carried out to examine the dimensions of the scale and the results of regression analyses that tested the relationships between the subscales of the multicultural education scale and 3 relevant student outcomes. And then we'll end with a discussion of findings. So we adopted the view of some of the major theorists of multicultural education that the 2 major objectives of multicultural education are firstly to be culturally inclusive, so that students from diverse backgrounds will experience educational equality, and also to develop intercultural competence and communication skills so that all students will be able to adjust and thrive in this increasingly diverse world. And for this research, we started from Banks's 5-dimensional model of multicultural education. And this model goes beyond the early models of multicultural education, which focused mainly on recognizing differences. Banks's model outlines a more critical form of multicultural education where students engage critically with all cultural backgrounds, including their own, and recognize how identities are located within power structures. So in Banks's conceptualization, multicultural education includes firstly content integration, meaning that examples, evidence and so on come from a variety of cultures and groups. And this can be clearly applied to psychology as a subject, which is often criticized because of its one-sided focus on what we call weird samples, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic samples. And secondly, knowledge construction refers to what type of and whose knowledge is valued and not valued, whose story is told or remains invisible, which can again be applied to psychology in terms of the emphasis on weird societies. And thirdly, in equity, pedagogy includes diverse teaching methods and assessments to create equity in the learning experience for all students. And successful forms of this pedagogy can be informed by the insights of applied social psychological theory, such as Allport's contact theory. The 4th dimension outlined by Banks is prejudice reduction, which relates to the inclusion of topics in curricula such as prejudice, discrimination and racism. And these topics have a high profile in psychology teaching. And then lastly, empowering school culture and structure means that the culture and the policies of a school are supportive of diversity and multicultural education. And in psychology as a discipline, many scholars examine the impact of such policies on feelings of belonging, leadership, and so on. So leading from this, we wanted to explore some of the potential outcomes of a multicultural educational experience. And we chose 3 for this particular study. So firstly, there is a large body of research that provides evidence for how multicultural education can lead to increased school belonging. And we go by the definition that this is about how valued, supported and accepted students feel in their school social environment, very like the mattering that was mentioned earlier. But a lot of this work has been done in post-primary schools, and there's not as much within the university setting. Greater belongingness has also been related to enhanced identification with an academic domain, which can be defined as the extent to which an individual defines the self through their role or performance in a particular domain. So for instance, the extent to which being a psychology student is a valued part of a student's social identity. And such identification can influence motivation, and so it's an important student outcome. And lastly, past research would suggest that multicultural education within certain conditions can, should lead to students holding more positive attitudes towards culturally diverse groups. So to summarise this introduction, we had 4 key aims. To firstly explore psychology students and lecturers' understandings of multicultural education in psychology, and then to develop a new scale of multicultural education in psychology based on the qualitative data. Thirdly, we wanted to then test with a quantitative survey the internal structure of a new scale. And then lastly, we aim to examine the extent to which different aspects of multicultural education in psychology are associated with students' levels of school belonging, domain identification, and respect for diversity at university. So now I'm going to present the small pilot study that we carried out to meet the first 2 research aims. So on this basis, my colleague Gilselli designed and carried out a small qualitative study to identify facets of multicultural education, specifically in psychology higher education. So she interviewed psychology teachers and students using interview questions that were rooted in Banks's framework. So to this end, the pilot study tapped into 3 research questions. How did the teachers and students perceive and understand multicultural education? What are the strategies teachers adopt for multicultural education? And what are the challenges that teachers and students experience with diversity and multicultural education? So the transcripts were analysed with thematic analysis, and these were the themes and sub-themes identified. So the first was to do with the curriculum. One sub-theme critiqued the overly Western focus of the curriculum and the need to diversify the curriculum in terms of examples, theories, samples, articles, books and authors and so on, and different cultural perspectives. And the second sub-theme referred to multicultural content in psychology, and this was in reference to the inclusion of topics such as prejudice and prejudice reduction and cross-cultural differences in psychology. The second main theme mapped onto one of Banks's key ideas, that of equity pedagogy, and this also had 2 sub-themes. So one was in reference to diverse teaching methods and assessment, and the other was around student agency and engagement. The third theme was about embedding of multicultural education in the school context, which was divided into the sub-themes of diversity of the staff and student body, and the school's institutional values and policies in terms of equality, fairness, cultural diversity and gender. So leading from the qualitative findings, a new scale to measure the extent to which a psychology course in higher education was perceived as multicultural or not was developed, with subscales reflecting the themes. So there was one 7-item scale of multicultural curriculum, a 7-item subscale of equity pedagogy, and because we suspected that the actual diversity levels of a psychology department and its values and policies may not always go hand in hand, especially in low diversity national contexts like Northern Ireland, 2 subscales were developed to reflect the embedding and context theme from the qualitative data. So we had one subscale to measure the diversity and composition of the school context, and one to measure school values and policies. So here are some example items from each of the subscales, just to give you a sense of what the dimensions targeted. So I'll let you glance down through those for a second. So the wording of the items reflected both the findings from the qualitative study and the aspects of multicultural education outlined by Banks. But please do contact us if you wish to have a copy of the full scale. We'd be happy to share the full scale with you. So now I'm going to hand you over to Gilselli, who will talk us through the quantitative study and discussion of findings.
Hi everyone, I'm Gilselli. I hope the slides will go on. Okay, so let me time myself, sorry. So I will be talking about 3rd and 4th research aim. So testing the internal structure of the new scale and looking at these associations via a quantitative study. So the survey we conducted among psychology students across UK, but admittedly most of our students were from NI and and most of them, 97% of them were from NI, and a majority of them from Queen's University. So we had a new scale of multicultural education, and a number of relevant student outcomes like school belonging, domain identification with psychology, and respect for diversity. So the first thing we did was to run an exploratory factor analysis of this new scale, and more or less the factor structure actually confirmed our expectations. The first factor included all the 5 items of the school diversity and composition, and it turned out to be a reliable item. This is about student body and staff being racially, culturally, religiously diverse. The second factor, as we suspected, the values and policies turned out to be a separate factor from the student and staff diversity levels. And these were items about schools valuing cultural diversity and equality and fairness, and it was a reliable scale. The multicultural curriculum subscale had 7 items, but unexpectedly, it turned out to be 2 factors. But when we further looked at it, it's more of a methodological issue, because the second factor was the factor with reverse coded items, and both of these factors actually had very high correlation. So we decided to combine these 7 items as one scale, and it had an acceptable level of reliability. And finally, equity pedagogy, again, unexpectedly turned out to be 2 factors. But we found that the diversity of teaching methods and student engagement was a separate factor from student agency or decision-making power. So we decided to keep them separate, but the student agency items, unfortunately, they didn't turn out to be correlated with each other either. So we had to exclude student agency from the scale, and then kept the 4 items that refer to diversity of teaching and assessment methods to encourage active student engagement. So these are the levels. So what you see here, so the first 4 are the subscales of multicultural education, and this is a scale running from 1 to 5. So most students agreed that agreed with the values and policies and equity pedagogy, meaning that the schools of psychologies are valuing diversity, and they endorse a variety of teaching methods and assessment methods to promote active student engagement. What was less agreed, and not surprising probably, is the levels of diversity at the staff and student level, which is diversity and composition here, and the lowest value was multicultural curriculum. And in terms of the student outcomes, you see that most students reported overall high school belonging, strong domain identification with psychology, and high respect for diversity. So let's look at
2 minutes, Giseli.
Okay, let's look at the regression outputs. What you see here, first, the 4 dimensions of multiculturalism scale, and looking at the school belonging, we see that when students perceive that they have a lot of opportunities to actively engage in classrooms and that their schools value cultural diversity, they reported higher school belonging. School values also had a positive effect on domain identification. And finally, for respect for diversity, it was similar. Equity pedagogy and school and values and policies had significant positive effects on respect for diversity. So to recap, in terms of the research aims, we show that students and lecturers' understanding of multicultural education actually tapped into the bank's understanding of multicultural education. We were able to create a reliable scale with 4 subscales, and we showed that students had the highest agreement on school values, school culture being supportive, and schools of psychology endorsing a variety of teaching methods or the equity pedagogy. And interestingly, these were the 2 factors which had significant effects on student outcomes as well. I will probably not have time for limitations, but cross-sectional design, obviously with student outcomes, we cannot really be sure. And in the future, we need a larger group of students, a variety of students to test conformatory factor analysis, but also to investigate different students' understandings of multicultural education. I want to just end up with the takeaway message. Our results show that school culture and values are very important. When schools explicitly value cultural diversity, equality, and fairness, this had positive effects on student outcomes. Second was the equity pedagogy, or the diversity of teaching methods and assessments to encourage student engagement, that also had positive effects on school belonging and to some extent respect for diversity. But what kind of our in a way negative way, what our research shows that schools of psychology at Queen's and beyond still has a lot to do on diversifying the content of curriculum in psychology. Thank you.